Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Business Strategies Roundtable. Today, we are diving deep into the IT service provider space and are joined by Chris C.J. Johnson, a leader and evangelist for MSPs over in CompTIA. Chris, thank you for being here today and sharing your wisdom and experience.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Cool. So usually we do look into the entrepreneurial journey, but sometimes when we have experts in their field, we do look in your career journey because really they're pretty similar. Oftentimes, what you're interested in turns into a career if it gets done successfully, and a lot of the times, if you're an entrepreneur, that kind of is the same thing. So we're going to
Right.
take a little bit of a look at how you got to where you are. I think that there are probably thousands, if not approaching tens of thousands of people that are familiar with you from your um, time in conferences. You're very outspoken. You're easy to get to know. How did you get to this point where you've amassed enough technical knowledge and people skills to be a leader in the industry like you've done?
Wow. That's a lot of questions all at once. I don't know that there's that many that know who I am. I think my Facebook profile, I think I only have a couple hundred people that actually know who I am. So
Huh?
as long as I'm not getting my adrenaline rush from social media, we'll probably be okay. You know, the whole
Ho-
journey to, yeah, go ahead.
Before you go into your journey, and forgive me
Yeah,
for giving you so many questions. I didn't mean to overwhelm you.
it's all
Your
right. I'm sad now.
Facebook's your Facebook certainly isn't where people recognize you. And I think you're being humble because more people recognize you in your speakings and I mean, you literally are global in conferences. So it may not be that you recognize thousands of people by name, but I guarantee you, just because of, I mean, at the last IT Nation, there were certainly more than 1,000 people there, and I guarantee they all recognize you.
Fair,
You're a
fair,
humble
fair
dude
enough.
too.
Fair enough. All right, I appreciate that. I will say the best answer I can give you is it didn't happen overnight, right? So, I mean, let's be honest. I started my career when I was five, and so I'm only, 25. So we'll just keep the numbers there. Um, I think it's something that starts with being somewhat of a dreamer or an entrepreneur or having the entrepreneurial spirit. Like, I wasn't satisfied just having the job, right? So like early on in my career, I went to work for a company that specialized in data aggregation for prostate cancer research. That was early 2000s. Like everything's relatively new in the space as far as doing things in web application format, right? So like you didn't walk into an event space or a tech pavilion and go up to companies and ask them about their web applications, right? Like maybe they had a contact form or something of that nature, but that wasn't very popular back then. And one of the job role that I had at the time was I was responsible for user experience and overall information architecture design, the user experience from a design standpoint. And what I found out through a very quickly short period of time is I didn't enjoy doing things like form validation and trying to break things in a web application. What I enjoyed doing was, being able to identify how well does it run in different browsers, which back then, um, browsers were their own monsters, right? Like, Internet Explorer had, I think we were on like version 5 at the time was and 5.3 had just come out for Explorer. You had Netscape 4.7, you had Netscape 6, you had Netscape 7. Those were all out at the same time, and they were very different monsters. Firefox was in its early stages, and I finally sat down with our investors and the team and said, guys, we can't write a clean web application and expect it to work in more than one browser. Like we need to focus on one browser. And so that was the starting point of me having to do more than just behind the scenes tech work And like I had to actually really engage with people. Like I was a people person, yeah. Like I liked being social and hanging out with friends, right? But this was different. This was walking into a room feeling very uncomfortable, as I knew that the other people in the room were the experts. They were the ones that they were writing code, that kind of thing. Well, as the opportunity progressed, my role changed, and suddenly I was doing more of like, how do we do remote support to our the the organizations we supported all over the world. And this was back, so consider medical practice. I won't go into detail for the company, but independent medical practices all over the US and in parts of around the world where, at the time you didn't remote into somebody's computer. Like you memorized in your head, like, okay, they're on Windows 2000, Windows XP, fill in the blank. Now you know really how old I am. Um, and you would walk somebody through solving a problem without ever getting on their computer or being able to see the actual problem. And so it was a lot of phone conversations, being patient with someone who's extremely non-technical, and that's what got me going in this idea, like maybe I should do this as a standalone thing. And so that's how my journey really started to take off. I went and started my own consulting company to do what I had been doing. In fact, they were my first client. And
Ah,
as I started doing that, I realized that,
entrepreneurial journey.
yeah, it really is. And it wasn't until I'd had my MSP for about 8, 9 years that my business partner and I realized, like, hey, we just aren't passionate about owning this thing that is our MSP. We're
Yeah,
passionate about what we did in the journey to get here, which in many cases is why MSPs, business owners, start the MSP, was because of their passion for the work.
yeah.
So
The problem solving.
2016, yeah, 2016, I sold the company, and that's where I would say my unique skill set really took off. And I had the opportunity to, well, I mean, anybody who's an MSP that had to do hands-on, you learn a lot of different things. Maybe not well, but you at least have a good understanding of, you may not be the one to swap the motor out in the car, but you have a pretty good understanding of like where the valve cover is, where the master cylinder is, the radiator, versus someone who's never looked under the hood and has no idea what's there. So, I can talk about the engine, right? I just probably shouldn't be the one doing the actual work on the engine.
Right. It's
So,
similar.
so yeah, go ahead.
May I interrupt you? When it's somebody
Yeah,
else's,
please.
when it's a, I love the way that you're describing it, and then even more when it's somebody else's business and when you're consulting, it can be really challenging uh, to hold that in your mind as well. When I was in
Sure.
the restaurant industry, I would go into stores and it was my role to support whatever manager was running their store. And if you come in acting like you know where everything is in the car and tinkering around on things, that can upset people. And having
Sure.
that grace of recognizing I shouldn't be the one turning turning the
Yeah,
whatever is.
don't touch the car, right? Like
Yeah,
this is my baby. Oh, right, my bad. I'm gonna recommend a good mechanic then, right? Like,
yeah,
yeah, I think that's so that really was the tipping point in my career, and that's really not that long ago, right? We're talking about 8 years now. 8 years ago was when aha moment, sold the company. I stayed with a very large MSP for about a year, learned about what it meant to provide services to enterprise accounts. And that's a very different monster. You come to the table with something that's too cheap, you're laughed out of the room. You come with something that's too expensive and the value perception is not seen, you're kicked out of the room. And it's that finding it's kind of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Like it wasn't about the size of the bed or the how big or small the bowl was for porridge. It was all about the comfort level, right? And so that's the part that I think I've always practiced, is how do I make someone else feel comfortable about what I want to get their buy-in on? And again, like if someone was watching, my behind me is one of many bookcases throughout my office and my house that are mostly made up of business books. And especially earlier in my career, I made it a point, after it was recommended to me, to read The E-Myth by Michael Gerber, which is all about working on your business, not in your business. that changed my entire outlook on business strategy, business growth, being tactical versus strategic. And I transparency here, I often find myself going tactical when I should be strategic because of my enjoyment of being hands-on, right? Like if it's something that I can create or something that I can do, I of course want to do it. Even as bad as this sounds, like recently swapping out a radiator on my 2005 Ranger. But again, I don't do that because on a regular basis, because well, that's just not the best use of my time.
Yeah. But you love the
My
problem
entire
solving.
In that entire career path, one of the things that I had that was in my focus of passion was healthcare. That's how I really got into doing things with compliance. And that was such a narrow focus. I didn't realize it at the time, but when I moved into working for an MSSP, they were all banking. So I had the knowledge of how to do the assessments and how to interpret a safeguard, but I had never really applied it outside of healthcare. And when I did, I found out how much fun it was because now I could do both. It wasn't just the compliance and the safeguards. I could talk about the technical elements, particularly on things like MFA or needing to make sure your firewall does certain things. I could have that conversation. And I didn't know that my journey and my career path was preparing me really for where I am today. So those that know me know that I was involved with the CompTIA Cybersecurity Trust Mark all the way back in 2014, 2013. And many don't know that the trust mark was actually around since 2008. So that just gives you an idea of how long of the program has existed and now rebooted. And I would say that each year, two new followers or three new conferences where I meet somebody that was a meaningful engagement, and now they're saying, "Hey, we would like you to come with us over here," and that continues to. And I think that's for anybody. If you are willing to get out and go to the events, eventually that will turn into something more. And just like doing this, like we're doing this podcast right now. I remember the first episode I did of my own podcast back in 2020. I had been told repeatedly, start a podcast, tell your stories, tell other people's stories. And I'm like, I don't have the radio voice. I definitely don't have the face for radio, right? Like those kind of things.
That's
Um,
okay.
right, on the radio. And what was funny about it is as soon as I did the first episode, I realized I should have been doing this the whole time. Most people that think about doing something like a podcast or maybe a video series or any of those things, the only thing keeping them from doing it today is just the procrastination and the paralysis of what if someone doesn't like it? Guess what? Nobody likes it if you don't do it. It's just plain and
Right.
simple.
Well, not everybody is gonna like you, and not everybody is gonna hate you, and that is not
Right.
up to. And this, like I say, you, the
Yeah.
everybody, you. That's not up to you.
Right.
Because if you appeal to these people, then you're going to piss off these people. If you appeal to these, you're going to piss off these people.
Right.
Who you should try to get with is yourself. And if you can tell your stories and if you can listen enough to other people to learn and hear their stories, now you're going
Absolutely.
somewhere.
Yeah, it's like how many sub channels or subreddits are there on Reddit, right? Like you and I could probably not even come up with an accurate number if we were both trying to count it. The reality is that's how many or podcasts that are out there. Like if you go out and look and just search by category, there's usually tens of thousands. What you'll find though is very few of them have more than a dozen episodes.
Yeah,
And that's how I determine whether or not I'm even going to listen to someone's podcast more than a few times is how often is it getting added to, and how long has it been since the last time an episode came out? So I wouldn't propose to anybody to go out tomorrow and say, "Hey, 52 weeks in a year, I'm going to do 52 episodes or something like that," because that's potentially an unrealistic goal. It depends. But if
it's
you
a
go out
big
there with an
goal.
idea like, "Hey, I have topics and ideas around something that I want to talk about for the next 12 months, and I have content already put together for the three or four at the beginning, you probably have something. If I ask you, hey, what's going to be episode three? You're like, I don't know. Maybe you should reevaluate whether or not you should do a podcast.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. You talked about problem solving, and I think a lot of people in the IT service provider space get into learning about technology because of the love for problem solving. Where did that
Sure.
start for you, and when did you try to transition it into your work, or did you?
It's kind of strange to hear that as a question from a career focus standpoint. So I was a big advocate for building my own PC. So in the 90s, Pentium 3, Pentium 4, I was building PCs both for my family and friends. And back then you were buying stuff out of a catalog and crossing your fingers that there'd be compatibility because there wasn't a ton of information on it at the time. And when I was in college, I decided that I wanted to do I want to be a rocket scientist, which is completely unrelated, other than you might, if I could build a rocket, right? And I remember my professor telling me, and I don't remember what year it was in physics, but I think I was on year three, year two. I was on my third semester of physics, more advanced physics. Theoretical physics was what was one of the was the class I was in, and I discovered that math was not my forte, and I was actually one semester behind in the
Oh,
program that I
really?
was in to continue to go forward in physics. I had to get another math under my belt in order to continue moving forward on the physics track. And so I was discouraged, but at the same time, I'm like, I'm realizing I may not want to be a rocket scientist or an engineer. And so I met with my academic advisor, and they're like, well, why don't you consider something like computer science or information systems management or something along those lines? I was like, sure. Like, does anything that I've done thus far, you know, apply? Like, or do I have to start
Right.
over on credits? And so I ended up going into information systems management, which literally is applying, going from hardware assets to software assets, right? Or application and data assets. And I had this project that I had to do before I graduated. It was my practicum. I had to design and build a database for an application, and I didn't get to visualize this application. I was only responsible in my part of the project was coming up with the user profiles and access privileges. And that has translated to really everything that I am doing today, even though I didn't know it at the time, because I was putting together like, what should a front office person have privileged access to
Yeah.
see? What about the doctor? And I remember vividly, I got a D minus on my first draft. And
Holy cow.
the funny part is my D minus was because I didn't think through all of the things that those different profiles should have access to. I spent too much time worrying about what they shouldn't have access to. Well, no one's going to buy an application if I can't get to the things that I need, right?
Yeah.
So what I learned, and I think this is true today, it is easier to build for the all access than it is to build for the limited access. And what happens, and we see this a lot today, is they say, I'm done after they create the access that ensures happiness with user, instead of saying, no, now I have to prepare this for release. What is the actual appropriate access by user profile? um and I think that that's what shaped where I'm at with, really, it was that those things happened and they were a part of my journey, and I didn't plan on those things. They were not what I did from the career path. It just happened to
Yeah.
be on my resume that I did these things in school. So, first job, they're like, yep, you're going to be the systems administrator. Here's the MSDN toll-free number. Good luck. And you're like, what's Windows 2000? What's Windows NT? Like, I had no idea what those things were, but I had a Microsoft card. I had 5 calls I could use up before I would have to spend another $250.
Wow, that sounds stressful.
But it wasn't, because you don't know what you don't know, right? Like things
Yeah.
that were kind of stressful at the time was we hosted everything in our own office for the project. So, I've got
Wow.
fiber channels to, SAN, all
Yep.
that stuff in there. And you're like, don't touch that because you might short circuit. I think I went through three $1,500 NIC cards in my first year because the flooring in the server room was carpet, And well, we know what happens when your feet walk across carpet. You tend to build up an electrical charge. And so that's
Wow.
what happens. So in my
100%.
second year, we rebuilt out a server room and we moved most things to a data center, but then we designed the server room so that, well, those aren't problems anymore.
Amazing. So would you describe yourself as largely self-taught by experience?
Yeah, I did not ever go to school for anything in the IT space at all.
So
So
you're
a
an
lot of
advocate for
hands-on.
that, huh?
I think that I'm an advocate for school from an educational standpoint. So like if someone was, say they in high school or graduate high school and they don't know what they want to do, I probably wouldn't encourage them to go invest in a 4-year college program because that's a lot of money spent to find out what you don't want. But there's a lot of opportunities in that trade space or even just boot camps to give you some ideas around where you might be successful. But then if you know what you want, let's just say you decide, I want to go all in with cybersecurity. Well, go get a degree in cybersecurity. I know that sounds crazy, but like they now have real programs that take you through different trajectories that like give you some understanding of a lot of different things that I don't think you get that experience when you just go to a boot camp.
Absolutely. We've got just a few minutes left here before we transition over to how MSPs do cybersecurity. What I'd like to ask you are a couple of social related questions. So one is if you can give a recommendation for folks that are uncomfortable at conferences, either communicating with people or kind of getting out of their shell, because I think in the IT service provider space there might be a little bit of that feeling on occasion. If you could give some advice to those folks on how to be comfortable and get out of their shell in conferences, I think that'd be great because you've done an amazing job of it.
Take a friend.
Yeah,
I hate to say this, but treat this no different than, having a wingman at a bar. It's easier when you have someone that you already know. If that's not possible, most events that we go to, especially in the IT space, are there's a lot of networking opportunity. Go to the table that's got space and introduce yourself. Odds are 9 out of 10 times you suddenly have a new friend. That's the space we live in. If it doesn't happen the first time, don't be discouraged, don't give up. There are some weird, strange, not so extroverted enough to engage in some cases, but don't give up. And I think the easiest place to do it is go talk to the vendors at their booth. I guarantee you, they will talk to you for no other reason than they might get your business, right? But I have found that some of the people that I would consider my closest friends today, at one point in time, I met them in whatever role they were at a booth somewhere in our journey over the past however many years.
absolutely. What should people be trying to accomplish at conferences when they go?
So I would argue that you go to a conference with an agenda before you get there, or the conference will largely be a waste of your time. Um, I think that it's very easy to get caught up in the networking and time at the bar.
It's
And
real
that
easy to get caught up
prob
at the bar.
right. Um, so have an agenda, right? Like, what is it about this conference that has drawn you in? Like if you're a ConnectWise or Autotask or Kaseya, whatever products you might be using, if you're wanting to go find out what's on their roadmap, one of their big events might not be the best place to gain that information. But if you're like, I want to go meet other people using the same products as I am to bounce ideas, those are great places to go and do that. Or if you're looking to find out who are vendors that now work with fill in the blank vendor that you use already, what are the integrations? Again, those are great places to go because you have an opportunity to ask them really pointed questions around how does this work? Because usually in the tech industry, they don't just send salespeople to work the booth anymore. That's how I would approach it.
It's a great point. And then it's a lot faster, especially if you go with intention in mind, because you don't have to schedule all these calls and go through all these sales cycles. You can just sprint up and down the lines and get the information you need. Well, thank you
Yeah,
for that, and thank you for sharing your journey with us. We're going to transition now over to our topic of the day, which is how MSPs actually do cybersecurity. And where I'd like to start, if we could, is with the difference between an MSP and an MSSP, in your opinion, because I think some of these terms start to get tossed around
sure.
in ways that can be hard to specifically nail down.
Yeah, and I think that there's room to debate this. I think there's a lot of people that have differing opinions around the nature of MSP versus MSSP. If I was to give it the simplest explanation, MSP, managed services provider, right? That's about how I would explain that one. That doesn't mean that they don't do security. It just means that that's not the only thing that they do, right? MSSP, I would argue, is managed security services provider, and in most cases, someone that's in that MSSP category has a very focused and narrowly defined
Mm,
service or product services stack than would be in an MSP model, right? They
right.
might do firewall management. That might be the only thing that they do. But again, an MSP is doing firewalls and printers and cloud management of applications, and the list goes on and on and on. And in many cases today, that's becoming less and less of it. We're just a jack of all trades, master of none. But again, I think an MSP, whether they include security services in their offering or not, are doing a much broader delivery of services to their clients than what you would see with an MSSP.
What's your recommendation? Is, and maybe not recommendation because maybe you don't want to give. It's obviously depends on the car, right? But for
Yeah,
the average car, what would you say is the right strategy around either trying to be an MSSP or focusing on being more broad and being an MSP? What do you think the mindset should be on folks in the service or IT space now that are seeing security coming and maybe eating some of their lunch? How should
sure.
those people engage with it?
Well, in most cases, an MSSP is not looking to gain MSP type clients. They're not going out there and going, I just need someone now that has problems with printers and I can complete my portfolio. That's just not the nature, right? On the MSP side, whether they partner with an MSSP or more specifically a vendor that looks a lot like an MSSP, they can get there very fast, right? They can become a organization that is selling MSSP services, but I discourage them calling themselves an MSSP because of what they've bolted on through a third party, and be transparent about it. We're managing this relationship. We're project managing this relationship. We're helping with responsibility matrix in this relationship, right? But to really build out your own MSSP, I start thinking about things that are involved. If you're going to add a security operations center, well, you didn't add a network operations center to your MSP. So what makes you think you can add a SOC, right? Like, there's a definite lift that becomes bigger and bigger if you're bringing those things in-house. And you don't have a lot of opportunity to fail before you're just done in the security space, right? Like, if I fail, if I fail hard on protecting you, my client, and that's the services I'm selling you on, you're probably not going to stick around, and there may be lawsuits involved if I fail hard enough, right? So that would be the way I would approach it. Like today, if today I was standing up an MSP, I would be very focused on the types of clients. Maybe it's by size, maybe it's by industry. And I would put together a strategy around how to provide services to those businesses and do it in a way that's largely cloud infrastructure focused. Because I don't think it's hard if you are already doing on-prem in some cases to shift to cloud. It's so like, know what it is that you're wanting to do before you find yourself having to go get a different set of tools and start all over again.
That makes a lot of sense. So you just mentioned tools. How do you recommend service providers or folks that are considering security engage with the acquiring of tools? Because in most scenarios, you need tools to be effective, but it can be a distraction. How do you give advice there?
And I think that, and this is, you've probably heard Matt Lee, or maybe Matt Lee and myself together, Yellow Brick Road, or Shoots and Ladders when we argue about safeguards. But one of the things that he has done with a group is to build out, how does a tool or service satisfy the safeguard? And so you got that where, working with vendors to identify how their tools or services help solve for a safeguard. But what's interesting is if you're looking for tools and services to address a safeguard, you probably have already failed if you're focused on, I'm going to go find a tool to solve this, then try to solve and understand the spirit of the safeguard, the what and the why that's being asked of you versus I saw on the internet when I Googled, this safeguard, a tool popped up and I'm like, boom, that's the one I'm going to use, right? Um,
Yeah.
we know that like for example Cention with endpoint hardening, if I'm doing control 4 in CIS, I know that because I know enough about Cention, I could just go and put their product in and now I've done the secure baseline configuration for say that asset. The problem with that approach by default, not that that's not a good idea to do it at some point in your deducing of how to solve for the safeguard or control, is you can do those things manually. You might even need to look at what is the hardening that needs to be done before you get to the point where maybe it's too much hardening on that system and it no longer allows you to do what your business does. And I think that's where people get in trouble, is in that space.
So you just talked about how you don't need the tool to execute, and this leads into, I think it leads into another topic that we wanted to hit on today, which is just because you're selling cybersecurity services doesn't mean you're providing cybersecurity. And I what you said led me to this thought because of you could just do it manually, and selling the outcome is a lot different than the actual execution of the outcome. And you said another thing that I
Sure.
thought was extremely important. You don't have a lot of extra lives as a business providing security. If you fail, especially early on, you're likely
Yeah,
losing the clients related to that. So, and this is a point that is yours. So, add to it and kick this around in the ways that really tickle your fancy. Selling cyber isn't doing cyber.
absolutely not. In fact, I would argue that if you don't have the right governance maturity, strategy, and culture dialed in, that you probably are only selling cybersecurity. You're not doing cybersecurity, and it's not something that's at least embedded into your culture. It's not embedded into the way you approach your own internal work, model, if you will. And I think, we go back in time a little bit when we did white mail email services, white label white label email services or phone services. If something in that equation breaks, you're on the hook for all of it. And we all know now most do not white label anything in the mail category, right? Like it's Google Workspace, it's 365, it's whatever. There's
Right.
a reason why we don't white label that anymore, right? Like we see if Microsoft has an outage and they think it's, Acme MSP, they're not going to accept that as a good answer. If it's Microsoft, they're like, yeah, it's Microsoft. What are you going to do? Right. And I think in the security services space, it's even more critical to what you communicate to your clients, like what is or isn't being protected, what is or isn't being delivered, because otherwise it's all assumed. And I think when you tell them that they have any sort of security services in place, that you are very, very particular about how you explain that to them, because if not, that's assumed that what they think you're doing is all of the things that you might not be doing.
Talk a little bit more about that assumption, if you don't mind, because you're coming from the IT service provider space, and it's likely that most viewers that do choose to listen or watch this one are going to be in the IT service provider space because of the topic. But why is it that IT service providers have to avoid the assumption that everything is going to be covered? Why do the other business owners think that they're going to do everything?
I think the assumption is tied to ignorance. And I don't mean
Okay.
that to be negative towards the client. It's because they have put their trust in the solution provider to take care of them, and they don't necessarily know how to articulate all of that information back to saying, I assume you're doing these things. They just don't know how to say that, right? And I think part of this is tied to the world we used to live in. And that was, an IT service provider. Here's the bundle that you get: silver, bronze, silver, gold. And most don't look at it. They see the price tag and they're like, what do I get for this? And you're like, well, the firewall will be plugged in and the blinky lights. And if you ask me to, I'll set up some rules besides default any. And that in many cases was called firewall management. The antivirus and spam filtering and malware, whatever widget, anti-malware app that might be, was part of a bundle package that was literally articulated as part of the managed services agreement. It wasn't spelled out as, hey, antivirus and firewall management and fill in the blank are part of the security services offering. This is what we put in for everybody. And now today you have this similar model, might have more security tools, but I think still even a lot of MSPs are not articulating what those things are. Not the companies that make those products, but like, yes, you have endpoint detection and response. This is how it's structured. Here's the responsibility matrix. And yes, you have a part in this. If you don't answer the phone, we're going to shut everything down and isolate it. Wait, we can't go offline. Well, okay. If you answer the phone, potentially we avoid you going offline, right? Like, and I think that's where we still have a lot of education to do between MSP and client.
I and I'm so yes, 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 and so I work with organizations on their sales process and marketing process, and I'm of the mind that effective sales is value communication. And if you're doing the sale process and you're selling cyber and people are buying, but they don't understand what it is that they've bought, it's negligence, in my opinion. Or maybe negligence isn't the right word. Let me be careful.
Sure,
It's poor sales practice. It's low ethics sales practice, and it may
sure,
not be intended to be right.
sure.
They're not intended to go out and scamming. But if you're selling something and somebody's buying, you've got to make sure, as the seller, that your customer is going to be taken care of and happy with what they've bought.
It's
So
they are
go
all
ahead.
that way, Zach. I think that's something important. It's not, I don't think it's the ethics part. I don't know that I agree with that. I think, I mean, I get your point, but I think it's more of a, I have an opportunity and I'm going to adjust whatever it is that I'm selling until they're happy with the price tag,
Right.
instead of, this is the baseline minimum that I'm comfortable with, that
Yeah.
I have defined, and you can choose to come on board at this level or higher, but anything below this line, we're not the right fit for you. And I think that's where I would say, to your point, of it starts to get into that blurry area of ethics, because if you're willing to compromise and go below that bar for that particular prospect just to get the check, well, the world around you is not that forgiving anymore. So good luck with that, and I hope it doesn't burn, because I think it's going to burn pretty bad.
And if your client is ignorant, it's one thing if the client is educate in an educated way making the decision. But if the client is making the decision and you're guiding them towards a decision that may not be sufficient just to get the sale, that's where I think there's an ethics issue.
Agreed. And I think we're on the same page with that. I think it was more of like the sales guy and bad ethics, and I think it's more of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
The
Right.
bad ethics isn't, to your point, it's not necessarily even intentional. And I think that's what comes back to you as an organization. If you're starting your MSP today or whatever it might be, you need to define this before you start because, yes, you're going to be very discouraged if everything you try to do, no one wants at the line or above. You may have to reevaluate what it is that you're positioning.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. So this leads into scaling. What you've just said, if you want to build your organization, consider these things ahead of time so that you can build your sales team so they understand what they need to be talking about. One thing that you mentioned to me is that to be able to deliver security and to be able to scale your organization, it doesn't necessarily need to be a specific size or a quote, quote, large organization. I would love to learn more about that from you.
Well, MSPs are constantly looking at ways to scale without hiring people, right? Those that are not doing lifestyle MSPs, they're largely looking at what tools or services can I bring in that help offset the FTE now more than ever? What I think
What's FT? I'm sorry, forgive my ignorance.
full-time equivalent. So the FTE resources, we don't want to bring on another, if I go, oh, we're taking on 6 new clients, well, what does that mean to my business? 1.5x FTE or whatever it might be. But if we bring in this third-party tool, it costs a little bit more per endpoint or whatever, but it lowers the overhead or keeps our overhead low. The piece that I think prevents most organizations from scaling is the lack of governance. In fact, if you look at CIS Top 18, the level one or our implementation group one, it is largely in the governance category, like have a program, have a plan, have a process, and it's repeated throughout that top 18 control set. And so when I think about that, for MSPs, that's often the heaviest part of the lift. They can go turn on DHCP logging, they can go turn on MFA, but asking them to write a policy and talk about it with their staff and do the awareness training around why this is so important, that prevents scale. And it also increases the risk and probability of when something bad does happen, the recovery is not going to be likely.
So, if you were to make one recommendation as it relates to scale and speed of scale to service providers out there, what would you say?
Think about it like a franchise, right? If I handed you the binder to run my new McDonald's that I just had built, could I go flip the burgers and, drown the fries in grease and all those things? Could I do that with just the documentation? If not, you're probably missing a few things in your documentation.
Awesome. Well, I know we're not going to be able to go the full hour today with your schedule. So, first, I want to thank you again for being on. Is there anything that you want to leave listeners with before we make our way towards wrapping up?
Yeah, I'll just say this. This has kind of been my mantra for some time now. We talked about this earlier about how to connect and network. Cybersecurity is a lonely and scary place. So this is what I'll leave you with. A journey together is an adventure. A journey alone is a nightmare. You decide which way you want to go about doing this, but I would argue one sounds far more compelling than the other. That's what I would leave you with.
I love that. Leave us with one last thing, which is a little bit about CompTIA, because I think they're a
Sure.
pretty good partner to have if you're on a lonely road.
Yeah, so I'm with the association formerly known as CompTIA. You'll hear some announcements coming out in the next couple weeks about what that means, but by and large, it's business as usual. And so come visit us. We've got lots of material to help with cybersecurity, getting started with managed services, marketing, and all of that is at a really low cost for what you would think would be thousands and thousands of dollars, and it's not even in the thousands of dollars. So I'll leave you with that too. I'd love to see you and others get involved with CompTIA. We do this because it's together an adventure. Alone is a nightmare. So there you go.
Thanks, CJ, and thank you again for being here. Give Elmo a high five for me, and
Will do.
everybody have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.
All right, we'll see you.